Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. Over the last 2 years, I've interviewed over 150 people around this question, not to provide you with the universal answer, but to help you find and define your own answer to this question. On the 36th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Susie Orbach. Susie is an acclaimed psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, prolific writer, best-selling author, and social critic. She is also the co-founder of the Women's Therapy Centre in London and the Women's Therapy Centre Institute in New York City. Additionally, she is a recipient of the first Lifetime Achievement Award given by the British Psychoanalytical Society. In this episode, Susie discusses engaging with and participating in society, emphasising the importance of contributing to common missions and the sense of connection and meaning it brings. We also discuss the factors contributing to the decline of these values, the shift towards competition rather than collaboration, the influence of the era she grew up in terms of her own social activism, as well as the importance of maintaining curiosity in relationships and in life. If you're experiencing a sense of disconnection in life, with society and the world around you, if you are feeling a little isolated in your own world, this episode will provide you with plenty to contemplate regarding the potential outcomes of shifting your focus and perspectives in life to include the collective as well as the individual. Look, I found this conversation to be extremely insightful and also a conversation that gave me a lot of pause for reflection on my own approach to life. So I'm sure you're going to take a lot from this episode. And if you enjoy this conversation, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you're on the podcasting platforms, please leave a review, as I'd greatly appreciate your support at this stage of my podcasting journey. So without further ado, the 36th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. Susie, thank you very, very much for joining us on the What is a Good Life podcast today. As I mentioned just in our little preamble there, I'll become aware of your work in this year. So I was really excited to get the opportunity to speak with you today.
Pleasure.
Susie, as I have a tendency to start these podcasts with, it is with the question of, is there a question you're trying to answer as you move through life?
Gosh, I think that's a really interesting way to open up a conversation. I'm not sure there is. I think there is maybe there was when I was younger. Or maybe there is. I don't know if it's a question. I think the puzzling thing about life is continuities and discontinuities. Is that you kind of know what you're doing, or you're in it and you have some kind of a base, whether it's with your family, your lover, your friends, your work, your community, and then you get disruptions and you have to think again and be open to what you can let go of in terms of your own understanding of what's important to you. So I don't know. I guess it's a continuing question, and I think for me, grappling with the demise of civil society. I know there's social media, but to me, that is a different place. And I think trying to understand what's happened and how to live with the kind of constraint and hate and belligerence that is now really promoted in our culture particularly by politicians, and they're fig leaf for corporate powers, aren't they? So and the way that has dissembled and cut up society is so problematic that's the kind of thing I'm always struggling with, I guess, to answer.
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? It's when you just said there as well, not only the demise of society, but the constraint of society. In what sense do you kind of mean constraint?
Well, I think we all meet constraints in terms of what we're offered as. I like to be somebody who's contributing. I don't want to be somebody who's passively being fed stuff the whole time. And I feel that's a constraint. How do you even participate at a political level when you've got a Suella Braverman, where you've got, racists who are running this country? I mean, how do you participate? How do you contribute? How do you feel part of something that is being represented in a way in which you find abhorrent and appalling. So that's a restraint. That's a constraint on my humanity. I think we're all, or many of us are constrained, and then we have a smaller life as a result.
How do you balance that? Because it's almost this, when I hear that, I kind of think of the sense of how small the world can make us feel sometimes, like or how not small, but even in effect, like, do I even want to engage with this society? Or
Yeah, I think if I were younger, I might not, but because I grew up at a time where engagement was part of what we did, it isn't. I don't experience engagement being on social.
yeah,
That
yeah.
doesn't right. Whereas I do know it is a form of engagement, but it's not right for me. And I'm sure I spend much more time doing, I don't know, doing ordinary sort of, not ordinary, because ordinary things are lovely. But I'm sure I spend lots of time playing words with friends or spelling bee in a way that I just wouldn't have years ago, really.
When you say the demise of society, where like the sense of, I don't know, like just how have you throughout your life then, how have you kind of noticed the change, or even then noticed the change in your engagement with what you're experiencing from
Well,
your
of course,
outside
part
world?
of it is age as well, isn't it? It's not just the period of we're living with, but I suppose I grew up at a time when I thought the world was going to get better and that my generation was going to be part of that. And indeed, we were. We opened up a lot of things, really a lot of things. But then we had then the end of the 1970s happened with Thatcher here and Reagan in America, and the whole, just as we were trying to find a way of engaging, we'd be with all the liberation struggles. We got the most appalling kind of practices, which meant that no longer was it okay to live in a council house. No longer was there money for the councils to keep up estates in a good way. The schools were in difficulty. All of the, money was removed from cultural activities. Welfare became an insult. I mean, and so when I think about, so then we had to protest, not to open things up, but to fight for the things that were now being taken away. And that's a
Yeah,
different kind of thing. And it didn't get a lot better, right? And then we were sort of, those of us who were involved in feminism were sold women's power back in the form of girl power and big shoulders, which had nothing to do with, and having it all, which was nothing that we wanted, right? Because we were having a critique of being at the office at 6 a.m. till 11 p.m. or whatever it was, and having children and lovers and negligee, and that who gave a shit about that? So I think it's been such a retrenchment that we've had to fight all the time, and now anybody can do anything and be anything, but does it matter? I mean, I don't know.
yeah. This is this is a now everyone can be anything they want to be, but doesn't matter. Do you see this as a loss of values, and like I'm always kind of reticent to go back to a golden age, right?
Yeah, it wasn't
Because
golden. It wasn't
no,
golden.
no, no, and I know that's not what you're suggesting here, but even myself, because when I
Compared
think
to
of,
now, there was a sense of ordinary decency. Now, class society being what it is, there were so many constraints, right,
yeah,
for people, because class really operated at such a profound level. It still does. It's just in different forms. There wasn't a golden age, but there was a sense of reliability, or that we were all part of a vaguely similar conversation, right?
right, yeah, yeah,
Whereas when I turn on the telly now and I see people watching other people watching television and then having I think, like, what the hell? Okay,
I,
call me an old lady, which I am.
no, no, yeah, well, maybe like, well, I'm nearly 40, but maybe I'm older beyond my years. But I very much, I get that. How do you, how do you kind of not fall into a sense of, I don't know. For me, I'm asking even this question myself. Like, how do I not fall into a sense of judgment, or how do I kind of not pull myself out from society too much that I'm no longer an active participant? And I know, look, tons of the work that you've done, that clearly you're still you're still contributing to, to giving voice to your expression of your own essence and what contribution that will have. But I just mean, like, how do you do you try to balance that, or does a lot of does some of this give you a sense of despair?
I mean, I'm sure if you spoke to my friends and the people next to me, they'd say, oh, she has to have a rant about this or that or the other. But, we're all ranting, and then we
Yeah,
get on, we eat our meals or go to the theatre or make our contribution in the ways that we can, or play with our grandkids or children or whatever. So, I mean, yeah, we have a rant.
yeah. In terms then of, just even from the perspective then of, if you had if, like, what do you think is at play for a deterioration, even from a psychological perspective? Like, how do you kind of chart the descent from more decency?
Well, I think if you don't have a notion of society as being something you're all participating in, then you have a notion of only the individual. And only the individual means you're out for yourself. And then you're very vulnerable to support or to be tempted by the value system that comes from drug cartels or the mafia. But not you're not that corrupt, but there's the idea of you get ahead. You promote your kids as best you can. You do what is best for you, which is, of course, what everybody wants to do. But psychologically, there's such a sense of bullying in society. It doesn't look like it's bullying, but it doesn't look like competition, but it is an exclusion. And class society's terrible for everybody, mainly for the people who suffer most within it, which are people who are dispossessed and who are struggling. But competition as a way of living, as the thing that drives you, I think is pretty lousy too,
Yeah,
psychologically.
yeah. I think that there's it's strange how these things have kind of become a religion in ways, like competition, or even like even the idea of perpetual self-improvement or perpetual growth
Absolutely.
in GDP.
Yeah. No, I mean, the biggest industries, I mean, the guy who owns LMVH, the woman who's got 30% of L'Oreal, the fashion designers, the guy who owns Zara, they are the richest people in Europe. Make no mistake, cosmetics and fashion, body transformations, and haven't even discussed the food industry. They are the ones who are pushing individuals to transform themselves rather than transform society after they've dumped all this shit into it. And they are the richest people, and that is what we're supposed to aspire to? No, no, thank you very much. No.
You know, I've heard you talk before about our almost addiction or attachment to perfectionism, not just even in terms of our body image and things like this, but also even just at the cost of our own self acceptance or our own peace within ourselves. How do you think, in terms of, how do you think we get, like, we start to cultivate some of that ourselves so we don't get caught up?
Well, I think there's a difference, Mark, between excellence
Yeah.
and perfection, right? When you do your podcast, or I do therapy, or I do my writing, or cooking a meal, I'd like to do it as well as I can. and I'd like to be developing all the time. That seems to me a very different way of looking at things than perfection. I'm not trying to perfect something, because that's what is perfect? I don't really understand that. We're not purring pussycats. They're perfect. They don't have these issues. They look gorgeous. They smell gorgeous. They're lovely to touch or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Right? We're humans. We are complicated, knobbly, difficult people who have the desire to express ourselves. And I think expressing ourselves and learning about the world and ourselves and how we are in it, and trying to do what we can as well as we can, is a much more interesting activity than perfection, frankly.
Yeah, he passed last year, but there's a guy called Ramdas who I always enjoyed listening to, and he talked about the idea of when we walk through a forest, we're not looking at trees going, that one's too tall, too short, too fat, that one
Correct.
doesn't have enough leaves. And I don't know, there is something about this or my own lines of self-inquiry where I'm trying to balance that sense of how can I evolve just with my own essence and my own curiosities, rather than, I don't know, trying to press something on top of that
Yeah,
development.
that's a really lovely image, because we're all trees. And as we know, trees are interconnected.
Yes.
And what makes us interesting to the other trees is that we're different. And the thing is, of course, when we're adolescents, we all want to be the same. But then the minute we're the same, we need to differentiate. So, right, we have to be part of something and feel accepted, so that we can actually be the tree that we are with the other trees. But the point is that industries that are so profitable want to tell us that we should all look exactly like a birch tree of a
Yeah.
particular type. And you're right, it's a great image that he had, and it just drives people crazy, literally crazy.
But it almost, and when you said that, it made me think of the idea of when we try to present our uniqueness in the form of competition, like
Yeah,
being, the
yeah.
best birch tree, for example, because that's a template that we've been set. That's where we kind of drive ourselves to a sense of
Well, I
despair.
think if we all have to be Elon Musk, God forbid, right? It's which is what's held up as a kind of heroic figure now.
And how would you kind of categorize your ability then to, you know, as someone with I don't want you to, you don't have to speak on this, but your own objective sense of success and your own striving for excellence, or movement towards excellence rather than perfection. How would you kind of how would you, were there things that happened along the way that
I
opened
think
that
what
space up
happened
to you?
along the way was, when I was a teenager, there was Black Power, then there was the Vietnam War, then there was women's liberation. I was grew up at that time. So it wasn't about individual accomplishment, right? It really, really
Yeah.
wasn't. I do understand the difference because I grew up in that moment. My whole cohort grew up in that moment. And I was really surprised to have success. I mean, I had success on the back of creating a women's therapy center in 1976 with my best friend Louise Eichenbaum, and developing theories together. I wrote a book that had phenomenal success very early on. So that was really, I mean, it was also confusing to me, because I had a certain purchase that I didn't understand that I had, or I did understand and I didn't like it, and I also did like it. I mean, I don't think those things are quite so straightforward, really. And but I never saw it as it was mine at that point. I mean, once you've done something, which I did with Louise and did individually, then you have the capacity to make other contributions. But we didn't know that before we did it.
Yeah, it's this idea of growing up at a time where you're mentioning all these various movements, and then almost like the shaping or the molding of what's important.
Yeah,
It sounds absolutely beautiful in
it
terms of
was
it.
great, Mark. And also, when I came back to live in England and we created the Women's Therapy Centre in 76, it just wasn't possible to find therapy at all. It was all hidden behind closed doors. And if you found it, it was very marked by patriarchal values and class assumptions and racist assumptions. So the fact that we created a women's therapy centre, and we of course got criticised, like, what are you doing? And I'd say, well, Tavistock doesn't say this will renormalize you. I mean, it doesn't say therapy for white people who want to be renormalized, right? Didn't whereas
Yeah,
it meant that we didn't the things that we were bringing out about the relationship between psyche and social could be talked about. And finally, my field is now talking about that. Finally.
yeah,
But that's taken a very long time. And still, most training programs have a lecture or two on women. And if you're lucky, maybe one or two on black people.
yeah.
Maybe one on class, probably not. Maybe one on gay culture. I mean, no, where did psychoanalysis come from? How is it situated culturally? Why did it arise at the point? Why is it so popular? None of the sort of cultural questions that you might want your trainees to understand.
I remember reading a paper by, I think it was Joe Heinrich, who has this thing of weird people, that acronym, Western educated, industrialized, rich, or developing, and just how much of the under, or how much of the participants in these studies were from Western and white cultures, and the kind of the universal ideas or assumptions we're thinking we're making about human beings when there's very little diversity in the pool originally.
Yeah, the thing that's so damn interesting, or has been so interesting, is that having a women's therapy centre where people had never been to therapy before, and they came from Belfast, they came from Dublin, they came from Saudi Arabia, they came from working class communities in London, and they came from feminist communities. I mean, they came from everywhere. Was I didn't know a lot of that stuff. I mean, I didn't know, and the whole thrill of being a therapist is you get to learn. Your mind
Yeah,
really opens up if you don't impose. Your job is to be interested and curious. So I got to learn some things about how people's minds raised in this situation, how they are. I mean, not I didn't get to know. I mean, psychoanalysis is an in-depth research project if you want to think about it that way, instead of taking a cohort. So
yeah.
that curiosity really and interest has always stayed with me.
I think I think this sense of curiosity, like I always think this is almost, it's one of the superpowers almost in terms of like having good relationships. Like if we cannot see a label, like because even sometimes in our own personal relationships, we can start to label people in our lives as that's them. This is what they stand for, not even just in terms of their views, but just their behaviors.
Correct. And then if we can think, oh, I wonder why. And then actually, if we can engage with them as opposed to locate them and freeze them in that.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
that's a
hard
really
to
nice way
do.
of putting it. Yeah, yeah. But they're definitely hard if it's been a long relationship. But the sense though there as well of like just this, I don't know, it's it's like we almost have this fear of finding out that we're not perfect, like that we can't like just allow. I think when we go on our own journey as well and even start to reflect a little bit more on ourselves, it's like, oh wow, I'm
I
a
have a lot of
wonderfully
trouble. Yeah.
I'm a wonderfully flawed creature, like not in this like self critical way, but just like, wow, I seem to be trying pretty hard, but yet I've repeated this mistake again. How bloody interesting! Like, and I think when we can kind of just recognize that, when we can go a little bit more curious or deeper with people, it's a really wonderful way to open up a relationship again.
Absolutely.
Susie, just intrigued with when you think about society even moving forward.
Yeah.
Sorry to go there. Sorry to go there.
Yeah, of course we should go there.
But just in the sense then of like, what do you think can play a role in bringing kind of some cohesiveness to us again? Like,
I'm really ignorant about that because I'm not the right generation to understand that. I really am not. And I know that there are people your age and younger who are optimistic about connections and thinking things through. And it's very, very clear that people who've been on the margins can make enormous changes, whether it's around the environment, whether it's around racism, whether it's around sexualities and all of that. Whether there's the same kind of interest around capital and how one deals with late capitalism, I think is another question. But I'm too old to answer that question about where that's the strength of that protest can come from.
you know, just as I mentioned, when I typically go through these interviews, I have a question at the end, which is what is a good life for you? And just based on what we've been saying in terms, or what you've been discussing in terms of the
Well, you probably know better than I do because I've just been talking to you.
but even the sense then of like a good life being some sort of social cohesion, like some community, some connection with
Some
people, like
connection, and
common.
therefore it might be quite small, or it might be an identification with struggles all over the world, right? That I'm not personally involved with, but I feel connected to. When
Yeah,
I call me old fashioned when I open my New York Times or my Guardian, as opposed to social media. But it's also having decent connections in my life of people who help me and I help them. I struggle with them, they struggle with me. You know, people are so damn interesting and so rich and caring and thoughtful, that besides the horror of the kind of mafioso, macho politics and personas, there's the person who comes to help you clear your garden who's absolutely lovely, right? And is a decent person, right? So, I mean, I'm always having those encounters. And I think that's a pleasure, or transforming food is a pleasure for friends. I mean, that kind of thing. Watching good theatre, watching good movies, reading good
it's
books.
it's amazing. I think I heard once that humans are the most destructive species alive and the most altruistic species alive, or something to this effect. And I love that sense of almost the despair with the kind of the ways of government, the ways of corporations, and then just the idea of a neighbor who comes around and helps you out.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
it's all of this at the
absolutely.
same time.
Yeah, absolutely. You can have a normal interchange, or an interchange that has integrity in it.
Yeah. Well, look, Susie, thank you so much for your time.
Absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed meeting you.
I look forward to continue to follow your work as well, Susie. Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
time.
Okay, Mark.